Today we have Greg with us, which is fantastic. If you watch the channel a lot, you may know that often I will get asked questions about DevOps stuff and just not have an answer. And usually when that happens, I will ask Greg because he is extremely knowledgeable, works with a lot of our largest corporate clients. I was wondering, speaking of DevOps, if you could start, while we're waiting for questions, start us off by talking a little bit about Kubernetes. An echo. I think it's one that
I think it was me.
It was you? Okay. I am well known for forgetting to mute stuff and then hearing an echo. Yeah, so tell us about Kubernetes/Kubernetes? I've heard both.
Kubernetes, yeah. When I joined, you and I joined Rasa about the same time, about a year and a half ago. And one of the technologies I didn't really work with before coming here was Kubernetes. And one of the main things that we've done for enterprise customers in particular, but it's really useful for everyone, is have a standard deployment based upon Kubernetes. So most people are familiar with Docker and Docker Compose, and it's a great way to deploy. You're starting to do development in your IDE and you want to do a first step deployment. Many people are familiar with Docker, and we have a Docker Compose setup, which is really a great way to get your containers up and running and connect it to the bot that you develop. But I thought I'd highlight Kubernetes because really Kubernetes is kind of a next natural step, and while it's excellent for enterprise customers and has many sophisticated features for scaling and for handling high availability environments, it's also really easy to run Kubernetes on your own laptop, and there's Kubernetes that'll run even on smaller systems like Raspberry Pis. And so we have a full-blown install for enterprises, but we also have something called the quick install you'll see on our site. And the quick install uses a lightweight Kubernetes called K3s, and it's a great way to get a production-like environment, something you're going to roll out on, whether it's on your laptop or on any lightweight computer. But you can do these full-blown deployments, having multiple replicas and testing all types of very sophisticated setups that you might do in a big AWS environment or Google Cloud or Azure. So I thought I'd highlight that. In fact, I'll paste in to the link here. You'll see on our site we call it the quick install, but what's behind the quick install is a Kubernetes deployment using K3s, which is a great project. I'll paste a link to that lets you do a very lightweight Kubernetes. So yeah, I thought I'd highlight that. If you're not familiar with Kubernetes, like I mentioned, I wasn't when I joined, and now I think find Kubernetes to be a pleasure to work with and provide a lot of flexibility and easy to use.
And the benefit of Kubernetes is that I'm gonna do my best here, particularly good at handling scaling up and down. If you have like a lot of users one day and then the next day there's like a little bit of a drought, you're not maintaining a bunch of expensive resources.
That's right. It handles scaling really well, high availability, and it has features that let you, like I even run it on some computers I have at home. I have some Raspberry Pis and some lower end Intel machines, and I can do a deployment and have parts of it run on a Pi and parts of it on an Intel machine. And the same thing, they can share storage. So there's just a lot of flexibility behind using Kubernetes.
Yeah, thanks for that intro. I think it's a really good technology to know more about.
I think Google actually started this project, and one of the objectives of Kubernetes was to let you set up a complex deployment and move it around, move it from your own hardware to Amazon's cloud to the Microsoft cloud, so you'd be independent of a specific environment, whether it's a home environment or obviously from a major cloud provider. You can move a deployment around using a standard open source mechanism for doing deployments. It's not tied to some specific environment.
So we do have a question here from Nick. My earrings are hitting the earphones and bothering me. Question. Nick is working on an FAQ bot. Is there any process or pipeline where chatbot fetches data directly from a website knowledge base, FAQ, and provides response in the chatbot window? If there is a process, can you please briefly give us the information, or is there a right practice to fetch the data? What are the pros and cons?
Yeah, depending upon what you're trying to accomplish, there's a number of different ways to approach this. The first and simplest is the custom action, where somebody asks a question and you run a custom action, and that can do any kind of lookup, any type of database. It's up to you. Call an API to come up with a response. We also have the ability to plug in your own NLG, native language generation tool, so that you would replace our NLG component with your own component. And we have links to all of these. And another direction, there's a blog post, is more of how do you use potentially a graph knowledge base as the source. And there's a post that was done by one of our research teams, by Tanya. I think it's about a year old, a blog post on that subject. Let's see if I can find that.
Yeah, I've popped it up here on the screen.
Okay,
this one
great.
On integrating Rasa with knowledge bases.
Right. Yeah. So that's another knowledge-based approach that Tanya talks about there.
So hopefully that helps, Nick. I know this is a project you've been working on for a bit, and I hope you're making good progress. Yeah, and it sounds like this tutorial in particular will be cool. Amina says hello. Hello, Amina. You in the chat again? Nick as well. And please feel free to add your questions to the chat.
I'm going to paste also a link to this NLG page. This is, again, another approach. Just completely do your own NLG. I don't see quite as many people doing the NLG, but there's more discussion of that approach to create your own server. But that custom actions are really the most common place for people to start. Just write custom action to do that.
And there's the link in the YouTube chat. So it's rasa.com/docs/rasa/NLG. Yeah. I don't see any new questions. So while we're waiting for folks to ask stuff, I want to say it's been like 6 months since the last time we did office hours together, Greg. And I'm wondering, so in that time, what is the Rasa feature that's been introduced that you are most excited about, or you think is the biggest game changer?
The NLU Insights that was just released in Rasa, I think is probably the most exciting thing. In fact, we can bring up a screenshot of the NLU Insights would really shows in a nutshell. You have that. Let me see if I can find it. Because what's great about NLU Insights is one of the things about just Rasa open source in general that is easy for people to overlook when they're doing their bot is the whole testing process. And there's a lot of really good command line tools and processes to automate the testing and gives you really good feedback on intent confusions, a common thing when you're creating a bot that deal with, and it will highlight issues with your bot. And so the Rasa test command, and there's also a really good blog post that Karen did about a year ago on testing. That's a really good introduction to testing. And so all of this data comes out of this testing, but this NLU Insights that you brought up really starts to go the next step. And instead of just providing the results of what do you need to improve in your bot? Do you need more examples? Do you have intent confusion? and providing it in a JSON format or errors that a pipeline could use or a developer could use. What NLU Insights is great is just for any user, a business user, anybody using the UI to be able to do is give feedback on how do we improve this bot? What are the issues underlying the bot? And this really takes the Rasa test to another level too in terms of the analysis that's done. So yeah, NLU Insights in terms of what's happened in the last 6 or 8 weeks in particular is a really great feature in Rasa X and really added value.
Yeah, I've in the live coding, we're working on an assistant, and it's just about time to deploy it. And I'm looking forward to having enough user data to be able to use the insights.
Yeah, I started loading up one of my bots that I did before joining Rasa, and right away I saw, oh, I need to do a lot of work on this bot. It's one of those things we talk about CDD being important, conversation-driven development. And this is just a little bot that I expose on my personal blog site, and it doesn't get lots of use, and it's just a demo. But when you bring that into NLU Insights, you realize, oh, this was fun as a test project, but if I really wanted to make this real and expose this to users, there's work to be done, and NLU Insights was quick at highlighting it.
And particularly if you're in a situation where, I think everyone's always in a situation, you've got limited time to do data annotation and work on maintaining your assistant because you're doing other things too. What's going to be most helpful and the best use of your time is not like a trivial question, right? That's a pretty hefty machine learning question. And being able to sort of simplify at least the first few steps of that process, I think, is pretty helpful.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. One of the things, the conversation-driven development is you want to get your bot out to users early, and frankly, as you talk about it, yeah, NLU Insights would help me early on in the process and later, throughout the process of creating a bot. It's always the challenge is when you're starting out, one person or two people doing a bot, you're never going to guess all the things people are going to say to your bot. And yeah, NLU Insights would help early on also.
Vincent and I were just working on something and had shared it with folks, and I'm always delighted to find just the sheer variety of ways that people say things and how few of them you can predict ahead of time.
Yeah.
Yeah, so NLU Insights, I think, definitely new feature, very exciting. And we're waiting for more questions. Any other features that come to mind that you sort of want to let folks know about or that you use a lot?
The other area of the product goes back to Kubernetes for me that I've been working with some customers and working with our engineering team on improving is around the Helm chart. So when you do, one of the nice tools that sits on top of Kubernetes is something called Helm. And Kubernetes has a lot of configuration files that you use. You do YAML configs. So instead of doing commands to set up your deployment to create things, you create YAMLs. So you have a standard configuration that makes it easy to replicate a deployment from one environment to another, or if you take stuff down in the test and you bring it up, you just have YAML files that describe the state of your environment, storage, networking configuration, the obvious things if you're a Docker user, the Docker Compose contents that say, here's the images that I need, I want this version, volumes that I want to mount, all of these things. When you're a Docker, you do those in Docker, and Kubernetes takes it to the next level by saying, here's my network config, here's where I want ports open to the outside and where I want ports allowed to communicate between each other. And so Helm is another of the tools we use with this Kubernetes deployment. And when you do a big deployment of Rasa, you'll use the database of your choice. We're using Postgres now. We used to use Mongo, and you can use different choices of database as an example. What Helm lets you do is take all of these separate configuration files for your Rabbit or Kafka, your database of choice, and instead of having, you might run 6 or 8 containers to run our full Rasa deployment. And instead of having look at the YAML files associated with all those things, Helm lets you boil that down to here's the key configuration things that you want to enable around your database, your message queuing system, obviously Rasa OSS and Rasa X, and bring it into a single configuration of the core configuration items. And with the Helm chart, so you have a single values.yaml where you say, I want to customize for my environment the networking or the storage or whatever. And so this Helm chart is an area where we really try to, again, make the deployment easier. And so if you look at Rasa X Helm, in fact, why don't I share the link? The Helm chart is in a Git, in its own Git repo. I'll put the link in YouTube. And so if you look at that, that Helm chart, inside of that is this values.yaml where you configure that. So working with these enterprise customers, there's additional things that they want to customize. There's some highly secure environments that work in where there's no network connections allowed at all, even inside of a namespace. So one of the enhancements, and you'll see it there that I'm working on this week, is to say, let's assume there's no network connections open, which is unusual, but happens. So I want to be able to specify exactly which ports are allowed between which containers. So, so this Helm chart is, again, part of that whole Kubernetes deployment to make it easier to do that deployment and easier to customize it.
Yeah, definitely very helpful to have that pre-written. I've successfully done Kubernetes deployments knowing not that much about the framework, in part because we have these pre-built Helm charts.
Well, I think the fact that we have an install called the Quick Install, and yet it uses this very sophisticated Kubernetes behind it, says a lot about how you can take a very sophisticated tool and make it into a quick install. And I think that says a lot for how powerful Kubernetes is as a platform.
Question from Amina. How can I measure the performance of my assistant? Ooh, $1 million question. The number of times we have the number of a scope or another tool. Yeah, so I think that Amina has a second question, but I'd say that's a second question. So let's start by talking about measuring performance. And it sounds like this is more of an analytics question, right? So looking at all the things that people have said to the bot, what intents are coming up more often, how often are we getting out of scope intents, how often are we, using our fallback intent, things like that.
Yeah, so I'm going to share a link here to the short answer is there are so many good analytics tools out there for analyzing data in the open source world. The Elastic Kibana dashboard is popular. Grafana is another dashboard, and we have customers using Sumo Logic, and there's just so many great analytic tools. So what we try to do at this point is provide a way that you can feed the user conversations into whichever tool you like to use. And so I'm going to share a link to how we walk people through this in our event broker. So right there is a link into our website I put in the YouTube channel. One of the things that comes with a standard Rasa deployment is Rasa OSS, the open source platform, has a mechanism using Event Broker that sends all of the live conversation data to Rasa X, so that Rasa X and Rasa Enterprise can use that to view conversations and that we were showing NLU insights earlier, and there's the conversation screen where you can see live conversations, annotate your data, and correct that. So one of the nice ways to do this is, since we already have this message stream from Rasa OSS into Rasa X with the conversation data, make your own copy of those events. So in that communication from Rasa OSS to Rasa X, we support RabbitMQ out of the box. There's a standard configuration, and we allow you to use Kafka also. So the page I linked to shows where you configure in the RabbitMQ, and you'll see later in that page Kafka your message queues. So you can add your own copy of the messages of the events. So we call it the tracker store, the tracker events. You can add your own copy, your own queue that you read separate from the standard one that Rasa X reads. And if you aren't using Rasa X, you can still load up, add this message broker to your startup and add this block to say, fine, I want to get a copy of those events. So from there, I have a personal blog post I did before I joined Rasa on how to, in a sample dashboard with Kibana and Elastic. And so pretty much all of the analytics tools out there that I mentioned have tools that will let them read events from Rabbit and from Kafka into Elastic, into InfluxDB, or which is typically what a lot of Grafana people use, or into Sumo Logic or whatever tools. So you just create the queue as it's shown there, point your analytics tool at the Rabbit or Kafka queue, and it starts consuming all of the conversation data. What gets interesting then is, now what do I do with this data? And there's so much valuable information in there about metrics of conversations people are having, what channels are they doing. As you mentioned, lots of data science work you can do on what's working with my conversations. I have customers that measure, did the user complete the flow, right? Whatever the flow is, they want to purchase something, or they're asking a question about a healthcare policy or their bank account, and were they successful, or did they get to a point and they had to bail out and ask for a live agent or get forwarded to a phone number. And so there's analytics on completion rate. Was I successful in answering the user's question? There's just quite a bit of analytics. I'm sure you could add to it about conversational information that you would be able to analyze out of that. The F1 scores are in there. The predictions of, we have both prediction of the intent, and you have the prediction of the action. So all those numbers about, how am I doing on on my NLU and my core predictions.
Yeah, so hopefully that helps me. I think you also get some of the information that you might be interested in NLU insights. So that might also get you like a quicker way to do some of it. But especially our enterprise clients usually have like pretty specific and also robust, I guess you would say, analytics needs. So they generally need quite a bit. And then Amina's second question is, when we use Rasa Interactive, so like doing an interactive conversation to train your Rasa assistant, could you consider this conversation-driven development?
Yes, I think we look at that conversation screen as one of the main places that you go to do the conversation-driven development, to review the conversations, to filter, filter based upon lower F1 scores or time frames. So that conversation review screen is one of the main places that we see people, reviewing conversations and improving on the intents and the whole flow of the conversation. There's probably a couple of really good blog posts by Alan, our CTO, on conversation-driven development and what are the things that you should be doing in that area. And we have some interesting internal developments happening working with enterprise accounts that we'll probably be talking about soon, about how do you analyze exactly really the question Amina raised. And Alan and our internal team have been talking and working with enterprise customers on this question of, do I have a scorecard? How do I analyze whether I'm really doing CDD, which really hits on what Amina's asking here. And so I'm not sure that this is released yet, but watch for a CDD scorecard, because that's a great question, and one of the active areas we're looking at. But I think for now, like you point out, the blog posts and the docs have some really good ideas on what are the things that you should be doing to improve your bot and doing CDD.
And I would just something to keep in mind is usually when we talk about conversation-driven development, the conversations are with you. So if you're doing sort of like in-person UX style things where people are coming in who would be using your assistant and having these conversations, using Rasa Interactive, I think that definitely counts. I would be a little bit cautious if you're adding too many conversations with the person or two people who are developing the bot, because again, people will surprise you. They'll never stop surprising you with the many ways that they will express themselves. Also, just to bring up another resource that might be helpful, the CDD playbook. So this is info.rasa.com/CDD-playbook. It's got a self-assessment I think will be helpful. I think it's related to the scorecard, but the scorecard is really for like teams. So this might be another helpful resource to sort of figure out where you are right now. Good question, Amina. As Sam says, Greg's background filter isn't working very well. I will say to get the quality of chroma keying that I have with my background filter, it takes a lot of RAM. I have a computer that was special built to do this. So most people's backgrounds are not going to be quite as crisply outlined as mine. Hello, Habib. DSI has a question that you might be able to answer. How to deploy Rasa using CI/CD with GitLab?
Good question. I'm going to pull up. So right now we have a GitHub Actions that we've been doing a lot of work on the last few months. I'm going to paste a link there, and this is all open source. So maybe can you bring that up, Rachel? And this
I'm not seeing some of the links you're pasting. Just Greg.
They
could be getting got by the automated spam filter.
Okay, I'll paste it in our chat.
That'd be great.
Sorry if that's not getting into the YouTube chat.
Oh, that's fine.
So this is obviously for GitHub, and the question was about GitLab. The short answer, we don't have a GitLab version of this, but this is all open source. So if you look at that link, so what I'm pointing to in that link is our financial demo. So we have several good demo bots that are great starters for any project. The financial demo is one of them under Rasa HQ. And inside of this financial demo, we've been building an example pipeline. And the example pipeline uses a GitHub action that Tomek, one of our developers, created to do the bulk of the work around training your data, running tests, pushing the model to a Docker registry. And so that GitHub action is open source, and this link that I provided here within the financial demo, if you go there, it's under .github and workflows. And the build and deploy file is the one in particular I'm highlighting that walks through exactly that you see there, walks through the steps of training your model, building an action image, pushing it to a container registry, running the test suites, all of that. And in fact, in fact, click on actions there, because I think the other nice thing is we talked earlier about tests. If you click on actions for financial demo, there's you'll see some of the output of this. And so we do a cross-validation where you see the results of is there intent confusion, and all of that gets added as an artifact when you do a new release. So you can see, okay, I've done a new release, hopefully added training data, trying to improve my model, and I can see the results of that in a nice table that shows how the intent, the quality, and the intent matching is working.
So hopefully you can use this as a sort of a template or a guide for GitLab stuff. I also have never used GitLab, so I'm not super familiar with it. I think the Git stuff at least is pretty well. It's my impression.
Yeah, it should.
Okay. Question from Isam. I'm sorry if I'm saying that incorrectly. My question is about my project for this year. It's a telecom chatbot for a specific service and offers, and my university wants to make the project not for a telecom company. They want it to be for any company. Okay, so taking a very like narrow assistant and making it more broad. Could you suggest, what would you suggest for my project? I'm sorry for my long question. No worries. And it's in Arabic. So it's a project that is specifically currently for telecom company for a specific service, and they want to make it more broadly applicable, and also it's in Arabic.
You know, I would say I mentioned we looked at the financial demo. That's one of the good starter bots. There's a help desk demo that's going to be generic to almost any company. So that help desk demo is probably a good starter one to look at, and it has an example. It'll show integration with ServiceNow, for instance, and have intents of looking up a ticket and submitting a ticket. And so that would be a good starter that's more general, not specific to an industry, and shows an example of tying, in that case, into ServiceNow. You could replace it with some other help desk or ticketing system. But I think under GitHub, under the Rasa HQ, it's called help desk. And I think actually you can get it off. You can get to those examples out of our main docs page, I think, right?
Yes, you can. And for Arabic specifically, one of our community members here. There we go. As a post on LinkedIn, ignore my notifications. My LinkedIn is a wasteland. That they wrote last year on modifying the financial assistance starter pack to work in Arabic. So this might be another good resource to look at, to sort of look at what changes they made. If you're taking the help desk assistant and modifying it to also be in Arabic, you could sort of like use this as a guide or a walkthrough. Yeah, it sounds like a challenging project, but a good learning opportunity. So I hope you have success with it. Mina says, I don't see Greg's links either. Yeah, I am definitely some of them. I think that YouTube's spam filter is getting some of them, unfortunately, and I'm not getting a chance to moderate them.
I paste them. Can you put them in? Is it little? Is it?
Yeah, I can put them in.
Okay. I'll give you some of these links to paste in. Because in my case, it shows them. It sounds like everyone else is not seeing them. Some of the links at the beginning I shared was that quick installs. The quick install is Kubernetes based, and the K3S project that we talked about. It's a lightweight Kubernetes for running your own personal Kubernetes. Then the NLG, covering your own NLG. And then on the question of the event forwarding to an analytics system, there's this event broker, how you make your own event stream.
All right. R is how you spell broker. All right, and hopefully everyone can see those links because I am the channel owner. We'll find out. It'll be an exciting learning experience for everybody. Yeah. So we did have another question from Daisy. Mina says thank you. You're welcome. Letting us know. Daisy wants to know if I override action session start with an intro question like hi, how are you? Do I need to add this new action session start to rules and stories? What does the story look like? I believe action session start is one of the default actions.
It is, and you can override action session start. And I've just given you a link on an example where we override action session start. Usually, though, you're going to, for this specific question, usually you wouldn't need to use action session start with an intro question. So what typically we do is, like when the user connects to whatever your app is, a web widget typically, or a mobile app, usually you let that UI present an initial prompt. And the Scalable Minds chat room is the widget, web widget that we reference, and it has a feature that just presents that initial response. But you can use action session start. But so what happens here is you have two ways to communicate to Rasa X generally if it's a general widget, the REST channel and the socket channel. And the REST channel and action session start, action session start's not going to see you connect until you do an actual initial REST call. So if you're using the REST channel, the action session start's really not going to help you present an initial prompt. You need the UI to do it. If it's the socket mechanism that you're using to communicate with Rasa, then I think the action session start would fire when the socket connection is made. I had to look at the code to make sure about that, and you might catch it that way. But I think the most reliable way is that initial prompt. Let your UI, whatever that widget is, present the initial welcome to the user. And what action session start is particularly good for is gathering profile information that your UI knows about the user. If they logged into this mobile app or whatever it is, and you know it's Rachel Tatman, you have a certain account type or whatever your app is, action session start is really useful to load all that data we know about the user, put it into slots so that you don't have to ask the user information that we already know because we have it in their database if they're a customer or a user of our system. And so that link we pasted there is an example or the financial demo. I think in that case it mocks out because it's a demo info about users, the user that's connecting, that helps later the conversation, make it a more natural conversation.
Also a good way to do authentication, right? Like if someone has signed in, you can be like, they're signed in.
Yeah, yeah, authentication, you're right, is a good one because the user authenticated already. You might pass a JWT token or something else via the action session start, and that token then allows you to look up information in the backend systems related to, your who you are as a user. So yeah, that's another good action session start example. Authentication.
Yeah. Good question. I hope that was helpful. Amina has a question. Can stories.yaml be empty? I'm using rules instead.
I think I don't. Yeah, I think that should not be a problem.
It might be a problem in 1.0. I think you don't need it in 2.0.
Yes, because 1.0 didn't have rules. So that's true. This would only apply in 2.0 when rules were introduced. Um, but we were having an internal discussion recently about rules, and frankly, if you have, there's a good argument for using rules. Rules are, kind of hard-coded paths, but frankly, that if you know that when this intent is said, you need to respond with this, do that in a rule, and let your stories handle more sophisticated aspects of the conversation flow. And when you want to deal with use a transformer because you've got out of context question and change of the flow, but rules are great when it's simple FAQ and yes, when you ask this question, I want you to respond in this manner.
Huh. I would say before I commit to really seeing more rules than stories, I would try to get some user interactions as soon as possible, like right now. If you already have an assistant you can train.
Yep, the sooner you can get people using it, the better, because you never know how the conversations go.
And stories really help your assistant be more flexible.
Yes.
And again, like I mentioned, people will surprise you. They'll never stop surprising you. They'll be like, this is the simplest thing. You could only possibly want to do this in one way. And people will be trying to do it, 10 ways from Sunday. So having rules really helps you handle those situations where people are doing things you did not expect them to.
Right.
Sorry, having stories. Rules are not going to help with that.
Yeah. But yeah, that's so important to get the bot to users early. Get to as many test users as you can. Have people starting to bang on the bot and review what's happening so you can improve the quality of responses.
Especially if you've been working in conversational stuff or chatbots for a while, because they've been around since what, the 70s. Like even in commercial applications, people have been doing this sort of work for a very long time, and because we now have the ability to handle more variation in input, more variation in types of context of conversations, the way that you develop assistance is kind of changing. So instead of spending a lot of time really thinking about everything that could happen and building ways to handle it ahead of time, the whole idea with conversation-driven development is that your assistant starts very simple, and as people begin to interact with it, you modify and update your assistant so it can handle the variation it's already seen better. And then as people continue to interact with it, you continue to add data, add stories, change the number of intents maybe. I'm a big fan of reducing the number of intents almost always. And really allowing your assistant to be able to capture those natural, organic conversations that, again, full of surprises. Never can expect everything that users will do.
You can never predict it.
I don't know. If anyone is on the fence about whether or not free will exists, trying to develop a chatbot, I think, is a good evidence piece that for sure it does.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I guess so. We're waiting for more questions. We got a little bit more time. If folks have more questions that they want to ask. So you were working on building chatbots for customers before you came to Rasa. So you've been doing stuff with the framework for a while. If someone's building their very, very first Rasa assistant, what are your main pieces of advice for them? What do you want them to keep in mind as they get started?
I think for me, one of the first things is just kind of understanding the overview of the system, the architecture. Mm-hmm. And so with Rasa, we have a standard structure to the project, and I don't have a data science background, so when I came to it, just understanding for me, understanding, and I think intents is a great place to start because I think it's pretty clear when I'm teaching somebody who's not touched it. I think that's just the natural place to start, right? And what are intents and what are we trying to do here, and how do you evaluate whether it's working or not? And so, looking at a new Rasa project, you look at the basic structure, and it's like, oh, okay, here's how these things called intents work, and how you make sure your intents are clear and there's not confusion between them. And so just understanding that that's a key component in any of the other, any platform has that. Then the other piece is once you've decided, you have the intent, this next piece of, okay, now we need to predict what do we do. And that's, you know this better, this is your field, but that's frankly to me seems in many respects almost more complex. And in a lot of respects, I think that's where Rasa as a company is even more on the cutting edge of having, when I look at, for me, one of the things too, besides beginning, is looking at people coming from other platforms. And I came from and was using one of the major platforms for a project before I joined Rasa. And within a couple of months, I realized, and working with the people who are setting their sights on some pretty high objectives, I realized that this idea of a state machine or a hard-coded, once I've matched an intent, I give this response, was just not going to provide the flexibility and not going to be the future. And that's what brought me to Rasa, is saying, we can plug in our own, both for NLU, I can plug in algorithms, but also I have something that's way more flexible. We were just talking about stories versus rules. Two big change in 2.0. So understanding, going back to your question, these two main pieces. We need to predict what was the user asking us. Hopefully it falls into something we can answer, and how do we deal with it when we don't. And now that we've decided the user has asked us question A, what do we want to do with question A? We want to respond with this. We want to start a dialogue. And so I think understanding these are the structures for somebody new to this, of what I have to have in place. And then you look at the Rasa project structure. The training data is structured in that way. And then pulling one of these example bots that we have, Financial Demo, that Help Desk, are two really good starters. Or just do a Rasa init, which has a very simple project that it will create for you to start with.
And specifically for the step that you mentioned about trying to figure out what your intents are and the flow of the conversation. My talk at the Rasa Summit this year, AI equals your data. In retrospect, not the most helpful title. I probably should have called it something else, but oh well. Goes over those very first steps of like, how do you figure out what people are going to want to do? How do you figure out what's a good intent? How do you start to write your stories? That might be a good starting place for folks who are new.
Yeah, I mean, just a flow chart, just example conversations, right, is a good examples of what I expect, how I expect the conversation to
go. We do have some more questions. Amina says, when I interact with the assistant, usually I use Rasa Shell debug. I wanted to know, the session started metadata none. What does it correspond to, and why is it always none?
Yes, I also do shell with debug, as I find it very useful when working on a bot. And so this session started metadata is new to 2.0 and helps clarify how you get at the metadata versus what we did in 1.0. So yeah, when you're using the shell, there is no metadata. I'm trying to remember if you can pass. You can pass /action session start, or you can do a /restart command, for instance, in the shell to kick off a new session, to clear your tracker store, and it will kick off action session start. Actually, I'm actually not sure if I can pass metadata from the shell. Rachel, do you know?
I do not. So metadata would be things like user and session, right?
The metadata, yeah, could be your user ID, right? Session ID, actually, yes, session ID. Now that you mentioned session ID, when you say the Rasa command, you can pass session ID when you do the, and that's a good example of some metadata. When you say Rasa shell, there's an option to set uh, camel. So I'm looking on the command line interface just so people know. I'm looking.
We're both
There's a so yeah, the Rasa
looking through the
shell's
docs.
got that conversation ID. So for instance, that ID you can set, that's your also known as a session ID, would be available as metadata.
To answer your question about if you need to set it, no. I think what that's telling you is that you haven't set any metadata when you started the conversation, and if you wanted to, you could do it using some of these. Oh, fitting. Okay, well, I can't make it wider. Oh, there we go. So passing in, like, I think conversation ID would be meta ID, metadata. I think and stuff would be metadata.
So the way I test metadata isn't with Rasa shell. So in that case, I will use a tool like Postman to send to mock up the REST call. So when I have customers asking questions about this, I'll put together a Postman or use one of the other tools that let you test out REST endpoints, and then I'll put together the JSON that their UI front end is doing, and test metadata, and the action sessions start that way. So yeah, generally I use Rasa shell debug. It's very great to go back and see what's happening with the whole NLU and core and the predictions that are happening. But for metadata, I would use Postman and make a REST call to the REST endpoint, pass your metadata, and test action sessions start that way.
Hopefully that answers your question, Amina. And then follow-up question, do you need to be a developer or a data scientist to use Rasa? No, you don't need to be. I would say if you're interested in building an enterprise assistant and maintaining it long-term, probably you're going to want at least one developer working on that. It uses a lot of sort of software engineering skills. But if you've got time to learn, then yeah, I would say anyone can use Rasa. Particularly if you're interested in just building the sort of conversation that relies on text and you're not executing a bunch of other code. It's adding human language to text files using a specific format, and I think folks should be able to do that if they're interested and motivated. Tom says, if the diet classifier gets like 95% accuracy, why would you need to be a data scientist to use Rasa? Yeah, so or a big part of the reason that we have a research organization and that we work on, these various sort of machine learning components is to make it easy as possible. So we're open source. If you would like to play with them, you are absolutely free to. But we're really trying to make it as lightweight as possible to build, a simple assistant that does what you want to do, that then later on you can customize as much as you need to. I don't know if you have anything to add there, Greg.
No, I agree.
Yeah. And another question. It sounds like you're really getting into your project, Amina. I'm loving seeing these questions from you. Is there a way to say everything that isn't mentioned as an intent or an entity, consider it is out of scope? Okay, so someone's talking to your assistant and they say something that you haven't, that doesn't fit one of the entities or intents that you've predefined. How do you add it to out of scope? You want to take this one, Greg?
Sure. I think, well, one is you can handle this via a fallback. It doesn't match any of your intents. Our Sarah demo bot, though, has a good example of creating an out of scope intent. And so we do that to try to capture technical questions that are related to Rasa, but we don't have an answer for. But we know this is, so if you ask us general questions about Kubernetes or Docker Compose, so those are good examples where we're not trying to be a Docker Compose bot or a Kubernetes bot, but those are integral to how many people deploy Rasa. So I think you'll find in our Sarah demo bot essentially an out of scope that in particular is trying to, I think, going back to the CDD process, how do we kind of improve this bot over time? And you could get something totally out of scope. You don't really want to ever be able to answer it. The fallback should probably handle that. But you could be getting questions that are in the general topic of your bot, but you can't answer. And so we use that in Sarah to capture these more general discussions and try to help guide the user, but it also helps us with CDD to see, oh, we're getting a lot of questions. When it hits on this technical questions kind of out of scope thing, it helps us to improve the bot and say, okay, we're getting stuff on certain areas that let's go ahead and add questions. Let's add intents around some areas that are, not totally out of scope, unrelated to Rasa, but are kind of an in-between. So that's one example that comes to mind, Rachel, of us using kind of an out-of-scope intent to help us improve our bot.
Yeah, and I would probably also recommend an intent, just to make your life easier. And also, if you think about it, right, people who are talking to a specific assistant in a specific situation are probably not going to say truly random things, right? They're going to ask for things that are slightly wrong, and you can probably guess at least some of those things. So one of the things that we've done in Sarah, I have a little example, the example code up here, is one of our out of scope intents. So this is done using a response selector, is a bunch of text that's not in English. So we've got some Spanish, we've got some German, we've got some French, Japanese, different languages that people might try to talk to the assistant with, and we just respond to this with oh, sorry, I don't speak that language, yeah. Or something like that. Yeah, so that would be my recommendation. And then we also have a sort of a discussion of doing this in the docs with the intents and the response, and then if you wanted to do some particular rule or have a fancier fallback action options. Yeah, good question. He says, thank you guys, this helps a lot. Good, I'm really glad to hear that. And pomegranate, pomegranate but with no end bits, and this might be our last question because we're right up against time, says, hi both. Do you have plans to update the official Rasa certification workshop course on Udemy to Rasa 2.x? Ooh, I am not super involved with the Udemy courses.
I just saw a post, and I think it's been updated.
It has been updated?
I see on the forum there was a post by Melinda saying that it is on 2.0. So I think that is recent. Let's see if the link shows. The link says anything, but I believe it was recently updated to 2.0. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I'm seeing some people sad that the time steps are slightly different now that the videos have been updated. So yeah, I think it is updated now.
This forum post from Melinda is from 7 days ago, and she states that it is now on 2.0. I think I heard saw that also
Oh,
on some other internal posts.
that's the wrong link. I'm so sorry that I just posted in the chat. Yeah. Yeah, so it's updated, and you can take it now. Yeah. If you have time for one more question, we have one more, and then we can call it a day. So Subranjit, sorry if I'm saying that incorrectly, says, I have a use case where I need to ask whether the user understood the last step, and there is a series of steps returned by an API like a JSON object.
Okay, so it sounds like there's a custom action that runs that returns data, returns information to the user, and we want to verify whether that helped or not. So yeah, that should be straightforward with a response, and specifically, my first Rasa bot has specifically had a feedback that we asked a lot, trying to figure out another way to do CDD, basically feedback. So yeah, that should be straightforward. Your custom action is going to send this data. You don't really see it probably, and then add to the story or rule around that to ask for feedback, and just like a normal utterance action response, and an affirm or deny basically intent is what you would expect in response to
that. And if you're interested in looping it, you're doing it for each of the steps, and you're collecting information, I would use a form for that. And then as part of the validation for each slot in the form, have a custom action that asks that. Is how I would do that. Because forms are designed to sort of loop and ask a bunch of questions already.
Yeah, exactly. And the form can be dynamic if it varies based upon the question that was asked, how many responses. The form can deal with the APIs and handle how many times through the loop it needs to go.
Well, I think that's going to be it for office hours today. Thank you so much for joining us today, Greg. Lots of good answers. I hope everybody who's working on assistance is having a lot of success and enjoying it as much as possible. Sam says thanks. You're very welcome. Thank you for...
Yeah, thank you, Rachel.
Just quick overview of the next little bit. There will be live paper reading tomorrow, probably. I might potentially be out. I'll post on the YouTube community tab if that is the case. And then there's not going to be any live coding on Friday because it's holiday, so I'm not going to be here. But we will be back next week on Wednesday with, I believe, Ty, who's our product manager. No, Ty is not the product manager anymore, is he? Ty, who's fantastic, has also lots of knowledge, and we'll be here to answer your questions next Wednesday. So we hope to see you then. Otherwise, if you have other questions that come up, please head to the forum, and we'll be happy to. Thank you so much. Thank you, Greg. I hope everybody has a great day, and we'll talk.